This is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and today I'm going to show you a little bit of knitting magic. Well, that's what I thought it was when I first saw the stitch, because I was like, how do they do that? Check this out. Stockinette stitch on one side. What? Stockinette stitch on both sides of the fabric. How in the world is that done? Well, I'm going to show you, and guess what? Spoiler alert, it's not really magic. It's just really fun knitting. So let's check it out how we can do this fun double stockinette stitch together. So let's learn how to do this double knitting with the stockinette stitch on both sides of the fabric. Super cool stitch to do. So of course with your regular stockinette stitching, you have that stockinette stitch on one side, but the back side is, not as attractive. You've got the purl bumps, and look at all this curling that happens with the stockinette stitch. So this kind of solves both those problems, the front and back, completely reversible, beautiful stitching on both sides, and there is no curling at all. It lays perfectly flat. So what you're actually doing when you're doing this double knitting is that you're producing two solid pieces of fabric on both sides. You're actually knitting both sides of the fabric at the same time, and that is what produces the stockinette stitch on both sides of the fabric. And it's really quite easy to do. It's not difficult to do at all. It's just a one row repeat and just this 2-stitch sequence throughout the whole thing. So to start, cast on whatever method you want to use an even number of stitches. Then for the pattern, you want to just start with a basic knit stitch, knit for the first stitch. The next stitch is a slip stitch, but you're going to want to first put your yarn in front and then slip that stitch as if to purl. So as if you're going to purl that stitch, but don't purl it, just slip it off your needle. Then move your yarn back to the back because the next stitch is a knit stitch again. So knit the next stitch, then yarn in front, slip as if to purl, and then back to knitting. So that is the 2-stitch sequence, slipping with yarn in front as if to purl, then knit. Slip as if to purl with yarn in front, and knit. Slip, knit. Very easy, and you will do this for every single row of your knitting. There is no difference in the row whatsoever. Very simple. Okay, so now you may be asking, is this possible to do in the round? Well, of course it is. Let's show you exactly how to do that. So here I am doing that same double stockinette stitching in the round. Now this is going to make for a really nice double thick brim of a hat, super extra warm, and then I will go on to continuing the hat in a regular stitch. But here's the difference for knitting in the round than with knitting it flat. There's actually a 2-row repeat. So the first row, or round I should say, because you're knitting in the round, is exactly like how we were just doing it, and that is knitting 1 stitch. The second stitch is slipping it with the yarn in front, as if to purl, and knit. So do that for your entire round 1, just the same as we were just showing for knitting it in with flat, straight needles. Okay, but then when you get to the end of round 1 and you come to your stitch marker, and it's very important to kind of put a stitch marker in place for this stitch because you want to make sure you're keeping track of your rounds. The end of round 1, slip your marker, and now we're going to do a slightly different stitch sequence. Now, instead of knitting this first stitch, we're going to slip that first stitch with the yarn in back. So just where it is, slip it. Then the next stitch is going to be a purl stitch. So you want to put your yarn in front to do a purl stitch on that one. Then yarn back again for a slip stitch purlwise for that one, and then back to purling. Purl 1 with yarn in back, slip as if to purl, and then purl the next stitch. Slip, purl. So that is round 2. So the only challenge with knitting it in the round is just to make sure that you are keeping track of which round you're on. Put a stitch marker in, either use a stitch or a row counter so that you can make sure you're keeping track of your rounds, or just jot it down on a piece of paper. One thing that you'll want to make sure you do as well if you are knitting double stockinette stitches either in the round or flat is that you will want to cast on about twice as many stitches as you normally would for a pattern. So if I was going to be knitting this in the round and I normally would cast on 60 stitches for a hat, I may want to cast on 120 stitches because you actually need a stitch for both sides. So you're needing about twice as many. You might want to play around with a little bit with it to make sure that that is accurate, as the gauge will be a little bit different with knitting double knitting than knitting it straight stockinette stitch. But that's the simple way to do it also in the round. Very cool to do. So this is a fun stitch. It makes for a really super double thick stitching for anything that you want for extra warmth, like a brim of a hat, cuffs, or just maybe something as simple as a pot holder where you want something double thick. So I hope you give it a try and hope you learned something new today. If so, please give me a thumbs up to like, and don't forget to subscribe to receive weekly notifications of new videos all about knitting tips and stitches and creative patterns. Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.